The United States has long led the world in developing classified aviation technology. But could it be possible that America was flying a hypersonic aircraft called Aurora as far back as the 1980s? Last week, we went over reports of Aurora from all around the world. And this week, I think we'll finally be able to put this mystery to bed. Let's dive into the surprising truth behind the Aurora legend. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Right off the bat, you should know that this is a part 2 in a 2-part series diving into the long-standing mystery surrounding the Aurora aircraft that's been rumored to be operational since the 1980s. Last week, we explored sightings and reports tied to Aurora spanning the 1980s and 90s throughout America's Southwest and Great Britain. And by the time we were through, I felt pretty confident in saying that it seems likely that the United States may well have been testing a platform like Aurora, if not Aurora itself, during this period of time. But it seems exceedingly unlikely to me that Aurora was ever an operational aircraft. This week, we're going to take a slightly different track and explore some of the other most prominent evidence often associated with Aurora. And in my research for this episode, I came across something that people who both believe and don't believe in Aurora have been getting wrong on the internet for a pretty long time now. Let's dive into how this program may or may not have been funded, and then what role media coverage and public perception may have played in reports of this aircraft, before finally drawing what I think is a very reasonable conclusion about how Aurora could have been real, but likely not in the form most people think. But let's get started with the money. The United States may have the largest defense budget in the world by a wide margin, but it also has the furthest reaching obligations. Branches have to continuously make compromises in order to meet their obligations today, while making sure they have the capacity to overcome any challenges tomorrow. And that often prompts difficult and even unpopular financial decisions. Things like divesting portions of the Navy's surface fleet, or the Air Force purchasing new 4th-generation fighters like the F-15EX, instead of more modern and expensive to operate stealth jets. Uncle Sam's pockets may be deep, but if you're going to take a multi-billion-dollar bite out of any line of accounting, whether publicly disclosed or secretive, somebody's bound to notice. And when it comes to Aurora, it seems as though a lot of the internet has, but they seem to have noticed the wrong thing. One of the most frequently cited facts that you can find about Aurora online is that the program was revealed as a $455 million line item for the production of a classified group of aircraft in a 1985 document projecting fiscal year 1987 expenditures. In just about every article about this you can find online, the story goes that this Aurora line item on that 1985 document was first covered by Aviation Week in 1990. But I'm pretty sure they all just say that because that's what Wikipedia says. Because after digging through a long string of citations linked to by outlets repeating this story, it doesn't appear to be entirely accurate. Now, I couldn't find the original Aviation Week story hosted anywhere online, but if you trace those numbers back to their earliest hosted source, you'll find most outlets citing a teal text on black background Aurora timeline page that lists the developments associated with this alleged program. The page went down in 2009, but you can still find it via all sorts of internet archives. And obviously, it's tough to gauge just how reputable this site is, so I kept digging. And here's the twist. That 1985 budget revelation was totally real. 5 years before that often cited Aviation Week story, at least 2 outlets in the United States covered the inclusion of Aurora in that 1985 document. The LA Times and the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. This was clearly a big story in 1985, and I'm sure coverage extended well beyond these 2 pieces. These were just the 2 I could get my hands on. But it's telling that one is out of California and one is out of Florida, because we're really spanning the entirety of the United States here. Based on their contemporary reporting at the time, the figures associated with Aurora were way higher than $455 million. In fact, the document called for $80 million for Aurora in fiscal year 1986 and $2.3 billion for it in 1987. But that's not the end of this story. Aurora did appear as an expensive line item on that procurement programs document, but that document was not the budget. The following year, when the 1987 National Defense Authorization Act, or the defense budget, was submitted to Congress, that Aurora line item and the billions of dollars associated with it were both nowhere to be found. At least part of the truth about that Aurora line item appears to have been revealed in 1994, when Ben Rich, the former head of Lockheed's Skunk Works, released his book, Skunk Works, a personal memoir of my years at Lockheed, which is well worth a read. According to Rich, the infamous Aurora line item was actually just funding for America's stealth bomber competition that Northrop ultimately won with the B-2 Spirit. I'm going to quote Rich's book here. The rumors surfaced that it was a top-secret project assigned to the Skunk Works to build America's first hypersonic airplane. That story persists to this day, even though Aurora was a code name for the B-2 competition funding. Although I expect few in the media to believe me, there is no code name for the hypersonic plane because it simply does not exist. Now, this is the most commonly cited fact from those dismissing the idea of the Aurora program out of hand, but I'm going to be a bit of a party pooper here, because the timeline does not line up with Rich's quote. That document came out in 1985, anticipating 1987 expenses. But the competition that would result in the B-2 Spirit, the Advanced Technology Bomber competition, began in September of 1980, with Lockheed's Senior Peg competing against Northrop's Senior Ice. And by October of 1981, Northrop had won the contract, which means the competition had already been over for literally years by the time this 1985 document was produced. So that expected cost very likely wouldn't have been for any sort of competition, but it may very well have been for the B-2 anyway. According to a 1995 report from the Government Accounting Office on B-2 procurement, it was right around this time that the B-2 program was forced to shift priorities, from principally being a strategic nuclear bomber to incorporating conventional bomber capabilities like delivering precision-guided munitions. Now, as we already discussed, the 1987 budget did not include the Aurora line item, but importantly, its total also did not reflect that $2.3 billion, which means the money wasn't just shifted into another program or distributed across a number of them. It seems the cost may have been anticipated and then mostly worked around. But if you believe my theory about the B-2, not without some headaches. According to that same 1995 procurement document, there were big concerns that the B-2 was not going to be ready for service by 1997 like it was meant to be. And among the problems giving Uncle Sam's accountants heartburn was still that issue of transitioning the B-2 to deliver precision-guided ordnance, some 10 years after the transition was mandated. Now, this is conjecture, but it looks to me an awful lot like the US Air Force went to Northrop in 1985 and said, we need you to transition this design to deliver precision-guided conventional ordnance. And Northrop said, yeah, we can do it in a year for around $2.5 billion. So Uncle Sam jotted down the number, it got a bunch of publicity, and they came back to Northrop and said, you know what, why don't we spread that out over a decade or so and I'll put it on my credit card. I'm obviously kidding about the credit card part, but this seems entirely feasible based on the way acquisition programs really do go. You've always got to be worried about how the public is going to perceive the expense. And with the B-2 already ringing in at between $900 million and $1 billion a year at the time, and importantly, we're talking early 90s dollars. It just wasn't a very palatable additional expense to associate with the program. So maybe Ben Rich was just misremembering the dates or the details, because although this money did not ultimately end up being allocated, if it had been, it does look like it probably would have been going to the B-2 program after all. In a real way, this really might be the death knell for the Aurora legend, as skeptics have long claimed. Because although Ben Rich did get the details of his statement wrong, it does look like this money was associated with the B-2 program. And that's really, really important to this story. Because after all, the entire Aurora legend was basically born in 1985, when press outlets originally began covering this Aurora line item that seemed to be associated with the development of a stealth aircraft. That stealth aircraft was not a hypersonic Aurora. It was likely the B-2. But reality is complicated, and special access programs are even more complicated. And the truth is, just because the Aurora name likely was associated with the B-2, it doesn't mean the reports tied to Aurora were all fiction as well. What this really means is that we may have been asking the wrong question all along. If the name Aurora is tied to a misconception about a line of accounting in a document, that doesn't necessarily mean we dismiss all of the reports and the sightings attributed to Aurora. It means that we need to be asking, did an aircraft that meets this general description, that carried advanced technology like a propulsion system that has yet to be fielded in an operational aircraft, ever really exist? And was it being tested over the American Southwest in the 1980s and 90s? The answer may be unsatisfying, but it really is maybe. I can say with a high degree of confidence that the US was not operating a fleet of hypersonic reconnaissance or strike aircraft in the 1980s or the 90s under the name Aurora or anything else for that matter. And really the best evidence I have to substantiate that is the billions of dollars the United States has continued to funnel into the development of advanced propulsion systems like those people claim were already operational in Aurora back in the 1980s. As we discussed briefly last week, if Aurora was real, in order to achieve hypersonic velocities, it likely was powered by a combined cycle or dual-mode scramjet, which is a supersonic combustion ramjet combined with a conventional jet engine. Now, we've talked about this technology in previous videos, but suffice to say, it is still the holy grail for hypersonic aviation. And in fact, the Air Force Research Laboratory's Mayhem program is right now soliciting proposals for a $371 million contract aimed at developing this very technology. Scramjets themselves are also under continued development under a number of different programs tied to America's hypersonic efforts. DARPA's Hawk missile has seen successful tests of both a Lockheed Martin and a Northrop Grumman-sourced scramjet over the past year. But importantly, these are not dual-mode or combined cycle scramjets combined with conventional jet engines that can take off and land. They're launched from B-52s and carried to speed using single-use conventional rocket boosters before the scramjets can come online. If the United States had reliable, operational combined cycle scramjet propulsion systems that they could use in a tactical aircraft in the 1980s, then it would be crazy that in 2016, the Air Force awarded $2 billion to GE and Pratt & Whitney to develop next-generation adaptive cycle engines, not capable of hypersonic speeds, to power the F-35 in the future. And it would be even crazier that 2 weeks ago, the Air Force once again delivered $5 billion in contracts to 5 different firms to develop new propulsion systems that, again, won't be hypersonic for the next-generation air dominance program. Now, cover-ups do happen sometimes, but that's an awful lot of money to throw in a hole just to cover up the fact that we already had operational dual-cycle scramjet propulsion systems in service when Back to the Future hit theaters. But it's not all bad news for Aurora, because there's a huge difference between developmental programs producing prototypes and technology demonstrators and operational programs producing fleets of aircraft for service. And while we're likely to hear about operational aircraft eventually, we may never hear about fleets of prototypes or demonstrators that are operating over America's Southwest in testing. Programs like Northrop's Tacit Blue, which helped develop stealth technology for the B-2, or Boeing's Bird of Prey, were flying over Area 51 years before anyone heard about them. And it stands to reason that exotic aircraft, some so rare there may have been only a single prototype, were likely testing systems ranging from advanced propulsion to new stealth technology all around Groom Lake throughout the entirety of the 80s and 90s. And to that very point, it's been credibly reported that in the hangars of Area 51 are a number of these technology demonstrators and prototypes that have never been revealed to the public, and maybe never will be. In fact, some, when they run low on storage space, are reportedly just buried in the sand. Instead of thinking of Aurora as a single secretive hypersonic program, I think it's far more likely that in 1985, when news outlets all over the world reported on this new classified stealth aircraft being developed by the US government called Aurora, that name just became a catch-all for sightings of unusual things that people saw first over the southwestern United States and eventually the world over. Because that 1985 document and the Aurora line item within it were indeed real and reported by reputable news outlets all around the world, there was not only excitement but credibility associated with the idea of spotting the Aurora in the sky. It gave people something to call the weird things they saw. UFO researchers will be the first to tell you that if you see a triangle in the sky and come forward saying you saw a UFO or a UAP, you'll be met with a fair bit of skepticism and maybe even some criticism. But if you spot a triangle in the sky and say you just saw the Aurora operating out of Groom Lake, you just sound like a guy in the know. So, while the legend of a hypersonic aircraft called Aurora is likely just that, a legend, that's not to say that the sightings associated with it, the exotic technologies it was claimed to contain, or the secrecy surrounding a program like it are fiction as well. Aurora may not be real, but out there somewhere, buried in the sands of Groom Lake, may lie an even greater secret, just waiting to be revealed. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. Let me know what you thought of this video. I had a lot of fun chasing it down, but I know it's a bit outside the norm. And make sure to swing by sandboxxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got something out of this video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.